Xbox as we know it today would not have existed if not for the Dreamcast. Ah yes, the Dreamcast, Sega's short-lived final hurrah in console hardware that released just a little too soon before its competition and had so much to offer and is beloved by so many. While there are a lot of reasons why things sadly ended the way that they did, one of the things that's always really interested me about the system is its place in history and how in a lot of ways, despite being the same generation as it technically, it really does serve as the precursor to the original Xbox. Which, by the way, if you're a big fan of Dreamcast, I got a lot of different Dreamcast videos on the way really soon. This is something that I've been kind of delaying on for a long time, and I'm finally dipping into including some ways to get the most out of your system today. So if you don't want to miss out on that content, make sure to subscribe if you haven't yet. When the Dreamcast was being designed, one of the really big partnerships that was announced before its launch was Sega working with Microsoft, specifically involving OS tools for the system. Basically, Microsoft provided a modified version of Windows CE that would work specifically for the Dreamcast, as well as make use of DirectX, with the goal being that developers could make use of these tools to create games that would work on both PC and Dreamcast seamlessly. And while that was cool, didn't actually really end up happening a whole lot. This was during a time when PC gaming and console gaming were viewed as being very different things. There were some games that occasionally bridged the gap or had a PC version made eventually or had a console port made at some point, but ultimately these were very different ecosystems. I mean, you still see a little bit of that division go on today, but that has a lot more to do with community and what platforms people prefer rather than just flat out the entire game libraries being completely different. And so while these tools made these options available, a lot of devs back then really preferred to just use Sega tools directly to make games that were for the Dreamcast specifically, allowing for a more optimized experience on that specific hardware, rather than make something that was less optimized but could run across a wider variety of platforms. Well, it didn't really work out the way that I think Microsoft wanted it to back at the time. It is really interesting to look at that though, and realize that that is basically the pitch for what the original Xbox was and what was one of that system's biggest strengths. It was a concept that was being applied just a little bit too early and probably didn't court the right developers quite enough to get them interested in trying something out like this. But in just a couple more years' time, it would work. And not only that, but the partnership and relationship with Sega would carry on into the Xbox. The Dreamcast met its unfortunate end in March of 2001 when Sega officially discontinued the system, and in November of that same year, Microsoft launched the original Xbox. And while a big focus of the system at launch was bridging that gap between PC and console game development, a lot of its early launch list, along with a lot of early confirmed games for it that continued that console side of things, were Sega emphasized. Obviously, as we all know, Sega did not stop existing the moment that the Dreamcast was discontinued. They just moved on to being a larger third-party developer. And while some of their biggest franchises like Sonic went immediately multi-platform because that was the big identifiable name, and of course they want to make as much money as they can going across as many platforms as possible, while a lot of their other franchises and new experimental titles, or things that were in development for Dreamcast specifically, ended up being turned into exclusives for the original Xbox. And this isn't something you were being subtle about. I mean, really, Sega was, I think, meant to be the kind of foothold Microsoft could potentially have in Japan for their system, which, as we also now know and respect, didn't entirely work out. But back at Tokyo Game Show in 2001, a big focus for Sega was, here are all these games that we are announcing that are exclusively designed for the Xbox in mind, two of which were launch titles for the system, including Jet Set Radio Future, which was initially intended to be a Dreamcast game, those plans got changed, and Gun Valkyrie. And again, these were not the only ones. Over the course of the Xbox's lifecycle, we got a lot of Sega exclusive titles, many of which were direct continuations of franchises that were either present on the Dreamcast or were older legacy titles that Sega wanted to tap back into. For instance, Crazy Taxi, Shenmue, and again, Jet Set Radio Future were all games that had previous releases on Dreamcast that now saw the continuing of the franchise live on the Xbox. While we also saw games like a new Toe Jam and Earl or Outrun 2, which was originally released as an arcade game but got ported to the original Xbox as well, and was a sequel to Sega's originally successful racing game back in 1986. There was also one of my personal favorite original Xbox games, Panzer Dragoon Orta, which was a continuation of a series that started on the Sega Saturn. Again, obviously Sega was still technically a neutral third party, and they did end up putting out a lot of multi-platform titles shortly after that initial window of the original Xbox. Sonic in particular did not have a particularly strong loyalty to the Xbox platform, but all these other games that they were working on, all these games that were initially planned for Dreamcast, found their continuing new life on Microsoft's new platform. And this also isn't exclusively true of just Sega. There are also some third-party developers that were making games targeted at the Dreamcast initially, or even had smaller multi-platform releases that changed over to being Xbox-focused once the system was released. In particular, Team Ninja, where the Dead or Alive games first had their releases on Sega systems, the first one on Saturn, the second one on Dreamcast, and then starting with Xbox, we saw Ninja Gaiden and the Dead or Alive franchise become dedicated titles for that platform. This is also why in the past couple years, when you see people talk about what other companies Microsoft should buy in the whole course of Xbox just doing acquisitions left and right, when people talk about a Japanese dev they should acquire in order to have a better foothold in the Japanese market, Sega is one of the names that really comes up a lot because there's already that historical precedent and root there. Even if it's something that has wavered over the years and, eventually Sega did go more full third party and there were some franchises that ended up not making their way to Xbox later on and maybe have now started to come back. For instance, the Yakuza franchise was originally not on Xbox, and then we basically got all of them at once and all come into Game Pass simultaneously, which is also the way that I ended up playing all of them back to back, and I'm now a huge fan of them and very excited for Ishin next year. But that's beside the point. There's this historical precedence for Xbox and Sega working together, and really in a lot of ways the Xbox does feel like it finished off the life cycle in Dreamcast's place because, again, it released right after the Dreamcast ended, and so many games that were planned for that system made their way over. In fact, while there's no real hard documentation about this, one story that's been told a lot in interviews and is spread by word of mouth is that back when the original Xbox was in development, the chairman of Sega at the time, Isao Okawa, actually directly approached Microsoft and had numerous meetings with Bill Gates over the concept of the Xbox basically being a Dreamcast 2 that would fully support backwards compatibility and play the full library of Dreamcast games. Now, of course, that did not happen. Supposedly the reason being why is the fact that while this was something that Microsoft was entertaining the idea of, ultimately it was something that just wouldn't work because they had their own plans for how online Xbox stuff would work, and it didn't necessarily match up with the online functionalities and features that Dreamcast games had. And while it's not something that actually happened, when talking about the history of Sega and Xbox, I can't help but obsess a little bit over what that timeline would have been like had that happened, because that would have immediately cemented such a stronger surface level relationship between the two as far as just, oh yeah, the Xbox is a direct continuation of Dreamcast. There is no arguments about this because it's playing Dreamcast games, and whether or not that would have really changed the long-term future of Xbox today. Would Sega have ended up being a larger part of Xbox's history throughout not only that initial system, but the other ones moving forward? Would we be seeing more Sega games that ended up being true exclusives to later platforms rather than just on the original Xbox? And would Xbox today have a stronger presence in Japan because in that timeline, Sega is Xbox and Xbox is Sega. And by the way, this isn't me pushing for any kind of, oh, I think Xbox should buy Sega because that corrects the timeline. No, that's an entirely separate issue and whole other thing we can maybe talk about someday if those rumors become really rampant and popular again. I just think it's really interesting to look back at this major point in gaming history where, things are in flux. One of the biggest names at the time stops having a place in the hardware race and basically gets replaced by another company, and it just didn't continue on past that. I just can't help but think what could have been. So that was just a quick little look back at the history of Sega and Xbox. I am planning on doing a lot more Dreamcast videos very soon because, again, it's something that for whatever reason I've just held off on for a long time, and the gates have opened and I just want to do a lot more. So make sure to subscribe if you want to see more content on that. If you enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up button to let me know. If you didn't for whatever reason, hit thumbs down. Good for me to know. And I will see you guys later.